Welcome back, folks. I'm Wavepunk, and this is day 118 of producing for a year, and today we began the process of in-depth mastering our EP. Today I only worked on this first track here, the character select. I think I like the way the track sounds. I don't know if I really want to tweak too much with like EQs and like, you know, putting a little like saturator on it or whatever. Like maybe some saturation could be good, but I need to do some research into like how to do saturation and stuff in Logic. Today I was just concerned with volume and getting the volume and all the kind of different numbers related to volume in a good place for this one track. When I look at Spotify's website here, they have some information on how they adjust loudness of tracks to make sure that all the tracks sound good as people listen through them, and how you can best prepare your tracks so that their normalization process doesn't affect the quality of your audio. Namely, they say we adjust tracks to -14 dB LUFS. We normalize an entire album at the same time, so gain compensation doesn't change between tracks. This means the softer tracks are just as soft as you intend them to be. Mainly that they lower the volume of tracks that come in at louder than -14 LUFSI. So integrated, that's the loudness of the entire track overall, not just like any specific instance of the track. Their tips for mastering though is target the loudness level of your master at -14 dB integrated LUFS and keep it below 1 dB true peak max. If your master's louder than -14 integrated LUFS, just make sure it stays below -2 decibel true peak to avoid extra distortion. Just because louder tracks are more susceptible, blah, blah, blah. What I was trying to do today was to get this track to be under -14 and maybe also under -2. I probably could go to -1, but the thing is that the loudness of a track is very related to its true peak. So what I was using was the multimeter here, and I was going off of its LUI up here. This is the integrated audio, and I would just sit and I would start the track and I would let it play all the way through, and then I would look at this number at the end of the track. And I kept a record of kind of like where I had various settings. The only things I was using to adjust the loudness of the track was the limiter and the fader of the track. So you can see the limiter is adding 2.9 decibels of sound while also knocking things down, right? And the fader is at -2.1 right now. I kept a list though of various values here from across my tests of this track. When I had the limiter at +1 decibel and had the fader at unity at the middle, the track was coming in at -13.7 LUFS, and I had a true peak of 0. Because I have a limiter on this track, whatever I set the fader to is what the true peak max will be. So I could have just at the beginning of the track not touched anything and just pulled this down to 2 and not worried about this number. Because remember they said if your LUFS integrated is louder than -14, just make sure that your true peak doesn't go above -2 and you'll be fine. But I feel like we could maybe just do both and that will probably feel better. So I started messing around with things. The first thing I did was pull the limiter up an extra decibel and a half or so up to 2.4, and I pulled the fader down to -1. Now my true peak was at -1, but I was actually coming in at LUFS 13.5. It got slightly louder across the whole track. While I was making it louder with the limiter, I was pulling it down in the master fader. The master fader does make a difference on the LUFS, the way our ear hears it afterwards, especially because it's got this multimeter on the stereo out after this fader. So then I just pulled the fader down to -2, or I guess -2.1 here that it's at, and that brought our LUFS down to -14.5. It was nice to see that linear relationship. So again, just to kind of show you these numbers here so that you can kind of track with me, lowering the true peak on the fader directly lowered our LUFS 1 to 1. So when I had my fader at -1, LUFS was at -13.5. And then when I brought the fader down to -2, without touching the limiter, our LUFS was -14.5. So that was nice. And then we were under 14. And our true peak at that point was at -2. So then I just bumped the limiter up to 2.9, as you see it on the screen now, and left the fader alone, and increasing that by 4, brought our LUFS up to -14.1, and our true peak's at -2. Now, does it sound good? That is obviously the question. So I have my unmastered track here, which has nothing on it. It's exactly the way it came in. There was some limiting and stuff done on this track in the master before I brought it into the session, but I'm just gonna play it through for you here, and you can tell me kind of what you hear, and I'll tell you what I hear. This is the master. main difference I hear is in the low end. On the new master with this new limiting, I hear the low end as more punchy. I actually think it sounds better, and everything's slightly, maybe slightly louder, which is crazy because the true peak is coming in higher on the unmastered track. And I think that the LUFSs maybe are louder, are higher in general on the unmastered track because we have done less compressing of the dynamic range. But with the more heavily compressed dynamic range on the master, I personally hear it as better. I hear it as the low end. I hear the low end as a little bit more punchy here. I'll play it in this one of the louder sections here. It's a very subtle difference, but I do think it makes a big one. I do think it is helpful, and it makes me feel really good to know that Spotify is not going to be doing some crazy compression on this track, and when we put it on to, when we distribute it, it'll probably sound the way I wanted it to. So that's pretty cool. I'm gonna do this process I just did with this track with all the other tracks, and that'll be the process of mastering. But today I worked for about half an hour or so doing that. Every time you adjust something, you then have to let it play the entire track through so that you can see what the integrated LUFS is on the multimeter there. Maybe there's some extension out there that can do that without me having to like literally hit play and just let it run for the duration of the song, but I don't know what that is. So that's all I had time for today. Thanks so much for watching. See you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.